Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am here with the author of an absolutely just really fun historical fiction work. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Sure. Hello, everybody. I am Eliza Knight. I am an author of historical fiction, and I am talking about my book starring Adele Astaire, which is a novel of Adele Astaire and her brother, Fred Astaire, which you may recognize that name as a famous Hollywood actor and dancer. And the book is about his sister, who is a little bit less known throughout history. She sort of got lost to time a little bit, but when they were dancing together, she was the more famous of the two.
It was such an interesting perspective on a story that I thought I knew really well, and I really love when a novel can do that for me. But before
Yeah.
we get into it too much, I was wondering if you could tell our listeners a little bit about your career as a writer, because you've been incredibly prolific before this. And if you could talk a little bit about, what drew you to historical fiction and how it led you to this project, perhaps.
Sure, no problem. So I have always been a writer. Before I even knew how to spell or write words, I was drawing little picture books of like castles and kings and queens and princesses. So I think I've always kind of been drawn to the historical side of things, even from an early age. And I never stopped writing. So I was first published in third grade in a charity anthology. And then in high school, I wrote for my school paper and became the editor of the paper. And I actually went into college for journalism originally. But all those facts, I wasn't really interested in writing straight factual stories. I was much more interested in fiction. So long story short, in 2008, I had my first fiction published. It was a romance. So I also write historical romance as well as historical fiction. And I think I've written close to 80 or so novels now. I love writing. I just don't stop, basically, even when I'm supposed to be taking a vacation. I can't help myself. Like once a story comes into my brain, I'm there. And the reason that I write historical fiction, I think, is because obviously the whole like love history, obsessed with history a little bit. I love to explore people's stories in the past and also bring those stories to life. And so we get to experience the lives of really interesting people or interesting events when we weren't able to see it because obviously the time has already passed and it's not happening anymore. So I think that's the fun thing for me, is really bringing the past to life on the page.
I trained as a historian before I came
Oh,
to
awesome.
libraries. And like my road into that was also through historical fiction. And, I did study like the facts like you did for a while. And I found I also prefer the fiction. And I'm wondering like if this is something that you felt when you were writing or researching a new project, which is that like in a weird kind of paradoxical way, fictionalizing history kind of lets you like access the truth a little bit more,
Mhm.
like this sort of like emotional truth, that is like missing from looking at like documents or what have
Yeah.
you. Is that like part of what you see as your project as a writer of historical fiction?
Yeah, absolutely. Because you want to be able to show that more human side of the characters too, whether they're factual or fictional characters, just what people were experiencing during that time period. And also, it kind of shows the parallels between how people felt in the past and how similar people feel now. So you get that connection to the characters, which I mean, I really love doing that. And also, just a shout out to librarians. I love librarians, and thank you very much. And my daughter is actually she works at a library right now. She's finishing her undergrad and then going on to grad school for librarian science. So just love you guys.
Thank you so much. That rules. And we're so happy to have her. We're glad she's entering the profession. So that's really cool. Like, because I was going to ask about your research process too. And, what comes first for you? Is it the idea for a book, or is it the research, if that makes sense? Like, do you get interested in a topic and then decide like, oh, I want to fictionalize this? Or do you like pick a topic and then research it?
It's kind of both. For starring Adele Astaire, I was actually researching another one of my books, The Mayfair Bookshop, and I was reading through some letters that Nancy Mitford had written to her sisters, and one of them mentioned this fascinating person named Deli, and I was like, well, who is this person? I thought I knew all of Adele's or all of Nancy's friends. Let me figure out who this is. And underneath it was annotated that it was Adele Astaire, and I was like, well, that's interesting. Who's Adele Astaire? And then I was like, wait, that's Fred Astaire's sister. I didn't even know he had a sister. So that was a little bit shocking. And I immediately just stopped working on that project for a second just to do like the deep dive because I needed to find out more information. And as soon as I got buried in that, I thought, okay, I have to write a story about her. She is funny. Her life is fascinating. And she's someone that most people wouldn't know about. Like I've done a lot of research about that time period and people in Hollywood and all that stuff. And I really hadn't come across her. So I wrote to my agent and I was like, what do you think about this? And she was like, that's fascinating. Let me check with your editor. And then my editor was like, that's fascinating. So that story definitely it was like through the process of researching something else that I came across it. Other times it's more like either I'm watching a documentary or something, or an article comes up and I dive into that and then I get an idea. So I think maybe a lot of it, maybe it does come from like researching, I guess, because I research things for fun. Like I love reading nonfiction. I love watching documentaries. I'm always learning things. I love going to museums. So I get a lot of ideas just from the natural study and interest in history itself, I guess.
Oh, nice. Yeah, it was so interesting to read about Adele because as you said, she was in her day more famous than her brother, but because her works aren't committed to film the way that his are, we don't really have the same like cultural memory of her.
Right.
So I'm curious, like, her life was so interesting. And was there something like that you encountered in her biography, that was like the inception point where you're like, okay, this person's story actually really needs to be told? Was there like a detail or a fact or something like that?
Well, obviously what I mentioned already about how she at the time was
Oh,
more
yes,
famous
yes.
than her brother was definitely one of those things. But the other thing I came across that I thought was just really fascinating was that during World War II, she was in London a lot of the time. She resided in most of, the time in London or Ireland, where her husband and her had a castle and then a nice little house in London. So during the war, she worked at an American Red Cross, like it was called a canteen, but it's like basically where American soldiers could come hang out, they could eat, they could dance, all that sort of stuff. And she was volunteering there, and she would actually write letters home for these guys, and she would sign the letters, from Adele, and then in parentheses it would say Fred's sister. And I just thought, wow, that's so interesting that she volunteered to do that and that she was sending these letters home for soldiers. I just thought that was really nice of her and also fascinating. And I did a little bit more research on other things that she did. For example, she held a fundraiser in Ireland trying to gain some money for the war effort, and some airmen, soldier or Air Force members, I think, they convalesced at her castle during the war when they were injured. So I just thought that besides being a stage star, she did a lot of really cool things for other people too. So I thought that was really interesting. There's sort of like a sweet side to her that wanted to help people,
Yeah, that really kind of brought her to life for me. And this idea that, like, uh, a lot of times with these actresses who had very promising careers, but then like
Mhm.
married
Yeah.
young and then had to sort of stop their careers, we tend to treat them like their story stopped at that moment, but like they went on and did so much more like
Yeah.
Adele did. And yeah, I just think that like that's another thing that interests me about like writing fiction of a biography, like because a life itself, like it has a beginning, middle, and end, but it doesn't really have like a narrative structure
Right.
necessarily, So like where do you find the narratives? Like where do you find the structure when you're looking at a life?
That is so hard to do because obviously, like, if I had written everything cool that I found out about her, it would have been like an 18-book series, basically. So I had, you can't include everything. So basically, I tried to find, you know, pinpoint like a few really important moments in her life, and then sort of frame the story around that. So for me, I wanted to start with her debut in London because the UK ends up becoming quite important to her. That's where she meets her future husband, and she has a life there and her friends and family. So I thought that was like a really pivotal moment for her, and that's when I wanted to start it. And then, you know, throughout that time period, she had a lot of ups and downs. So marking those moments and trying to fill in how she might have felt during those moments, with great things happening or not so great things happening. And then for the ending of the book, I really tried to end it on more of a high note, and just sort of leave it open for people if they wanted to then go do further research about her life, which there's still a lot more exciting stuff after that. But I mean, like I said, I probably could have just written like 18 books about her forever and just enjoyed the whole process. But I think just trying to find those like important pivotal moments and then fill in the blanks.
And I bet that's, you know, that must be a really fun thing to do when you're specifically writing about like actors, and especially like this era of Hollywood, you know, because like their public personas were so manufactured and so like meticulously policed and, you know, created and just guarded. So they put so much effort into like projecting an image into the world that wasn't necessarily like what they were actually going through. And that itself is like a really interesting source of conflict or inner drama. Like, so did you find yourself you know, like, did you find any press or anything that like gave you alternate perspectives on like the things that you were writing about? Or like, were there sources that you were like, wow, like you can't believe how they're writing about, if that makes sense, you know?
Yes, yes. So I was really lucky. When I was writing this book, when I first started writing it, it was during the pandemic. So a lot of things were closed. And towards the end of me writing this book, I'd been emailing this one library for like a year. But it was the Boston, it was at Boston University, the Howard Gottlieb Archival Center. They have an Adele Astaire collection. So finally they opened and they were like, if you can get here next week, we'll give you 2 days to like peruse the collection. And I was very excited because I didn't really know what I was going to find in there. And what I ended up finding was a complete treasure trove. It was all these scrapbooks from different articles about what people had written about her, different interviews that she had given, and then also her diaries. So I got to read her diaries and sort of see like what she thought about things, the true things, right? And then you could read those against some of the articles where she's sort of playing, you know, in an interview, playing a little bit with the reporter. And then I added that into the book. There is a section in the book where she's sort of teasing about whether or not she's engaged. And that was from real, like that really happened. And then also I found these really fun things. So they had, it's sort of like what actors do now, where they like endorse a product and they're like, I use whatever every day. You know, they're not really using that. And they did the same thing in papers, and they would write these articles in papers about like, I'm using Pond's cream and aren't I amazing? Like just funny stuff like that. I don't know if she used it or not. I think I did for a couple of things say that she went ahead and used it. But and then they would do like other little articles about like how to dance, and just like you'd see the difference between like her more personal diaries and then how she portrayed herself and how others portrayed her in the paper. So there was a lot of that. And that was, I mean, if I hadn't gone to see that, I don't think I would have been able to get as authentic a narrative in the story as I did, just from being able to really dive into her personality.
Wow, that is so cool. And like just as a, you know, the past historian in me is just like so excited about like somebody telling you it's like you have 2 days in an archive and just, you know,
it was amazing. It was like I did not take a break to go to the bathroom. I skipped lunch. I was like, okay, I only have this set amount of hours. I am not leaving.
Could you talk a little bit about Violet? Because there is like another story in this book, and it's a really lovely counterbalance. And you know, like their lives are similar in some ways, but also very different. And yeah, could you talk about like what went into like balancing the two perspectives and structure the story?
So a lot of Adele's story is about her rise to popularity and success and things like that. And we didn't really get to see besides a few flashbacks, what it was like for her to struggle from coming from nothing to being where she was. So I wanted to kind of counterbalance that with a character who was really struggling. Obviously, Violet's from the UK. She's not American, so it's a UK-based story, but you get to see a lot of the struggle, the personal struggles, and then you also see some of the things that Adele didn't have to deal with because she had an older brother that was, or younger brother. I say older only because he's taller. It didn't even make sense. Anyway, she had a younger brother who was there to protect her and sort of help guard her against any of the more nefarious things that happen in showbiz as far as power struggles with guys and things like that. So, but Violet doesn't have that. So you see what happens to a lot of women in show business, sometimes still happening today, who are being taken advantage of. And I wanted to point that out. And then also you see with their stories that when Adele is up, Violet's down. And then when Violet starts to have a little bit of a rise, Adele is going down. And I just liked that weaving in and out of personalities and people and life stories. That was really the reason that I did it, was I wanted to kind of play with both sides.
It's so neat, you know, and it does something really interesting, which I think is that, like, which is true of all history, you know, that like people come together in like totally unpredictable ways, and like some things happen just by chance, you know, and like there's but it also makes it like, I'm not saying this right at all, you know, like people's lives are all interconnected and interwoven and stuff, but then like a lot of whether people rise or fall is up to total chance and is like a chaos factor, you know. And so it really like it paints a very holistic picture of like what it would have been like trying to make it in this system in that time period. Yeah, is this a time period you think that you'll return to? Do you think you'll write about it again?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I have an idea that is being pitched to my publisher that takes place in the late 1920s that I'm very excited about. So we'll see if that comes out. My next two books that come out next year, one is about the Queen Elizabeth and her corgis. So it's not this, it starts out during World War II, but then goes into the 50s. And it's 3 points of view, and one of the points of view is actually her dog Susan, who was the matriarch of the Windsor Corgis, and I had a blast doing that. So that's a little bit different, but a lot of fun. And then I also additionally have a book coming out about Ella Fitzgerald and Marilyn Monroe's friendship that I co-wrote with my friend Denny S. Bryce. So that's another like a Hollywood type story where we're really diving into interpersonal relationships and sort of the rise and fall of show business. So that's sort of along the same lines, but it's not the same era. It's, 50s and 60s. So
wow, those both sound fascinating.
thank
And
you.
I hope that if you are interested, you'll come back to the show to
I
talk
would
about
love to. Yes.
one or both of those. Yeah, because they sound really great. Thank you so much for joining us.
I had a really great time chatting with you. So thank you for inviting me.
Very welcome. You're welcome back anytime.
Awesome.
Okay, listeners, please pick up Starring Adele Astaire. By the time that you hear this, it will be available near you. It's got a gorgeous, gorgeous cover. So please pick it up at your favorite independent bookstore or library. Thank you so much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.